War is physically and mentally harmful to both combatants and non-combatants. Death, injury, sexual violence, malnutrition, illness, and disability are some of the most common physical effects of war, while post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety are part of the emotional effects. The violence of war destroys lives of hundreds and thousands of people, leaving them and their communities emotionally distressed. The terror of war severs relationships and ruins lives. Since there have been wars, there have been studies on its victims' mental health. We'll take a deeper dive into what kind of emotional turmoil these people and their children and families face during and after the wars have ended. Hey guys, welcome to another exciting psychological facts video, where we talk about the psychological impact of war on its victims. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, so that you never miss a video from us and the amazing facts about the human mind we often bring you. Let's get started. Wars have done nothing but damage to communities around the world. The world has seen over 200 wars in the last 100 years, and their effects are still lingering across communities that were involved in those wars. We all know that wars can have severe post-traumatic effects on those in the front lines, but these psychological effects are equally prevalent among those that are not in the battlefield. Innocent civilians and children all go through extreme atrocities. Many of them end up not making it and are silenced forever. But those that do are no longer the same. While wars bring a lot of physical atrocities that include rape, torture, extortion, they leave a permanent effect on psychological issues that last for generations to come among its victims and their families. The combined effects of war, torture, and oppression often extend to non-combatants. Citizens, especially those trapped in war zones, are forced to participate in war-related activities such as murder and rape against their will. The collateral damage is not just physical, but has deep emotional and psychological impact on these people. Emotional suffering occurs not only due to direct exposure to life-threatening situations and violence, but also through indirect triggers, such as injury or death of relatives or caregivers, financial and economical hardships, loss of habitation, and continuous disruptions of daily living. According to one study, 1 in 3 children living in a war zone is prone to some form of PTSD, psychopathical symptoms, and psychosocial dysfunction in their lifetime. In Afghanistan, 67.7% of the respondents of a study had symptoms of depression, 72.2% had anxiety symptoms, and 42% had post-traumatic stress disorder. People with disabilities and women had the worst mental health status, and there was a significant association between mental health status and traumatic events. Survival strategies include religious and spiritual practices. Another study in another region there found that half of the population had experienced a traumatic event, and symptoms of depression were observed in 38.5% of respondents, anxiety symptoms in 51.8%, and post-traumatic stress disorder in 20.4%. One study on Bosnian refugees demonstrated a link between depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychiatric disorders such as disabilities. A follow-up study from the same group concluded that former Bosnian refugees who remained in the area continued to exhibit mental health and disability after initial assessment. In a community sample of 2,796 children in Kosovo, aged between 9 and 14 years, high levels of post-traumatic symptoms and grief symptoms were reported. This was related to the amount and type of exposure. Girls reported more distress than boys. Studies done in Cambodia, which has a long history of violence, highlighted by the civil war in the 1960s, culminating with the Khmer Rouge rule that destroyed the social fabric of the society, found that refugees had high levels of psychiatric symptomology after 10 years of being in war. A household survey of 993 adults from Site 2, the largest Cambodian displaced person camps on the Thailand-Cambodia border, found that more than 80% felt depressed and had a high number of somatic complaints despite good access to medical services. The change in the social structure led to the destruction of the existing protection system, such as village heads and village people, especially women's protection networks. Traditional healers who in the past played an important role in maintaining the mental health of the community have lost their assigned place after the conflict. A structured interview with 27 young people in Cambodia who were severely traumatized at ages 8 to 12 were followed up 3 years after baseline evaluation. It showed that PTSD was still highly prevalent at 48%, and that depression was present in 41% of them. Iraq, which has been at war for a very long time, also had several studies on the mental health of its victims. A study on 45 Kurdish families in 2 camps reported that PTSD was present in 80% of children and 60% of their caregivers. 4 Iraqi male refugees found that poor social support was a stronger predictor of depressive morbidity than trauma factors. A recent study in Israel found that 76.7% of subjects exposed to war-related trauma had at least one traumatic stress-related symptom, while 9.4% met the criteria for acute stress disorder. Another study reported that 20 years after the war with Lebanon, an initial combat stress reaction, PTSD-related chronic diseases, and physical symptoms were associated with a greater engagement in risk behaviors. A random sample of 658 people between ages of 18 and 65 were randomly selected from 4 war-affected Lebanese communities. The lifetime prevalence of major depression varied by community, ranging from 16.3% to 41.9%. The impact of the war and the previous history of major recessions were the main predictors of the current recession in the country. Another study on 118 Lebanese war hostages found that psychological stress was present in 42.1% of them, compared to 27.8% of the control group. An important factor that affected mental health was years of schooling and increased religious practice. A study of children aged 10 to 19 in Palestine found that 32.7% had PTSD symptoms requiring psychological intervention. 49.2% had moderate PTSD symptoms, and 15.6% had mild PTSD. Only 2.5% have no symptoms of PTSD. Boys were more likely to be affected than girls, and children living in camps suffered more than children living in cities. 46% of parents reported that their child's aggressive behavior. 38% reported poor school performance. 27% said their children were wetting the bed, and 39% said that their children had nightmares. This study also found that refugee children were more aggressive than non-refugee children. 38% of parents said shootings were the main cause. 34% said television violence. 7% were kept at home, and 11% said arrests and beatings of relatives and neighbors. The most common factors of trauma on children were witnessing funerals, shooting, sign of an injured or dead stranger or deceased family member. Of the children living in the bombing area, 54% had severe, 33.5% moderate, and 11% mild or suspected PTSD. Girls were more vulnerable than the boys. Women are more vulnerable to the psychological effects of war. There is evidence of a high correlation between the suffering of mothers and children in war situations. It is now known that prenatal and postpartum maternal depression are predictive of poorer growth in infants. The association between gender-based violence and common mental disorders is well known. Despite their vulnerability, women's resilience under stress and its role in sustaining their families has been recognized. The link between gender-based violence and general mental disorders is well known. Despite their vulnerability, it has been shown that women are more resilient in such situations, and it's widely recognized. Children are found to be alarmingly more affected by the war, especially adolescents. The most striking sample was that of Palestine. Studies on victims of war have shown variants of psychological and emotional damages on them. However, it has also been shown that people have shown a striking amount of resilience in more than half of the population. As we have more understanding of the effects of war on its victims, there is no doubt that we need a system that we should work on providing mental health care to them as a part of their relief and rehabilitation. As we study the consequences of war, there are several questions that still need to be answered. Are the psychological effects? What are the cases that need an intervention? How should psychological effects be measured? What is the long-term plan to measure stress-related symptoms? WHO and some other UN bodies have recently created a task force to develop mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings, but it is just a foot in the water when it comes to supporting war victims. We know that wars are going to be a part of the world for as long as humanity exists. We may try to attain peace, but while we do, the prevalence of ongoing wars and its effects are long-term. Consistent research helps us understand the issues on a microscopic level and brings us closer to aiding and supporting the people that are affected by these wars. It is going to be a collective effort, and all of us will have to play a role, no matter where we are from. Not all of us may be close to the war, but it is no doubt that it affects all of us. If you like the content of this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel where we discuss psychology and take you deeper into understanding how our mind works. Don't forget to hit the like button and share the video to support our channel. We will see you all in the next one.